Glenn, it's great to have you. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. I am following you on LinkedIn and every word that you post with the deepest sincerity. You have an acuity to cutting through the distractions and giving us insights about retail, wholesale, fashion, and the world of commerce that is remarkable to me. So thank you for what you do.
Well, thank you, Miles. I appreciate that.
Meant with deep sincerity. I like to start with a signature opener. All guests receive the trilogy of questions. You're welcome to tackle any of it, all of it, any way you want. So let me begin. Glenn McMahon, who are you? Who have you been? And most importantly, who are you becoming?
A great loaded question. Who am I? Yeah, I'm a lucky SOB. That's all I can say. I grew up in a small town outside of New York City and always had a passion for design and loved automobiles and architecture growing up. When I went to university, I took a job in a small specialty store in Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and I got the retail bug. So I'm one of the lucky ones that discovered early on in my career, sort of a path forward, if you will. And I'm a student of consumer product goods, retail in particular. And as you said, I've spent the lion's share in the apparel space and the fashion space, but I really love great brands and great products. So, that's a little bit about me. What I've done, I've been incredibly fortunate throughout my career to work with some of the best brands in the business and some of the most amazing, incredible leaders. I've I've been really, really fortunate. People ask me all the time, how did I go from, Donna Karan to Dolce Gabbana to Giorgio Armani to St. John Knits? And it was really just, a series of good fortune. And, each of the different places that I worked for, each of the different brands was sort of a different stepping stone or learning for me and just accumulated, a lot of great experience over the years. Today, fast forward, after selling St. John Knits in 2013, I started my own practice, management, advisory, and consulting because I really love the business. I saw a lot changing, particularly with the advent of technology. And I thought I could be more helpful to private equity owner founders, listed companies, having stepped outside of an operating role for one particular brand and be more of a generalist, if you will. And I've enjoyed that for the past 10 years. That's what I've been doing, a little over 10 years. Most of those roles have been longer term, 9 months, 16 months. So I feel like I really am embedded in with the teams, which is great in an interim role. It's interesting to me that this whole fractional or interim management is really taken off post COVID. So I was probably one of the earlier adopters with this model. And I love it because it allows me to have the flexibility to jump from category or vertical. So I've done work in technology with software startups in both rental and returns. And I've also worked in, luxury appliances and hospitality and giftable. So really extended my exposure beyond just fashion retail.
Glenn, remarkable. Before we begin and dive in deep into the trajectory and your journey, when was the last time you were genuinely surprised by a brand, a customer behavior, or a market move in a way that made you rethink something you were certain of?
Gosh, that's such a great question. To be honest with you, post COVID, there have been a lot of cases where, I've been a little bit surprised at how brands have responded reactive to sort of macro environmental situations and geopolitical. I would say that the thing that surprised me most probably is the dramatic shift in the business from a brick and mortar to a digital channel to now, what we call omni-channel, even though I don't like that term, cross-channel functionality. I think the biggest surprise to me is that brands, retailers, consumer product companies are still learning this. I still think that there's a big misunderstanding in the market on, best practices on how to engage with that consumer and how to attract new consumers to the brand. And that's probably, there hasn't been one single event to answer your question, but that's probably been the biggest mystery to me is, how consumer product companies have not been quicker to adapt to the changing in consumer behavior over the past, 6 or 7 years.
Why is that?
It's bureaucracy. I think that's what's happened is that the world is changing so quickly, and particularly with technology. To be fair, I think it's really hard for management teams to keep up with everything that's going on. and have their pulse on what it is that they should be doing that's best for their business and best for their consumer. So that aside, I would say that it's really just a rapid pace of change. A lot of the management teams are not prepared to take on some of these challenges. That's why I think the fractional or interim work is so important, because you have these technical experts that are on the sidelines that can come in, like myself, work alongside a management team or an ownership, an extra set of hands or muscle, if you will, to solve for a problem or a challenge. So, I think that, leadership are drinking through fire hoses. It's hard to keep up with the pace of changes. So, to be fair, I think it's a matter of there's a lot going on. And I think that the new model is okay, let's go to people in times like this. And I'll use AI as a perfect example right now. I mean, I can't imagine many boards are prepared for the advent of AI, let alone management teams. So we're seeing companies, fast and furiously trying to figure out, who's our best provider, who's the best platform. And a lot of mistakes are going to be made. That's okay, but this is happening in real time. So, I would say really, I would love to see brands be a little bit more open to saying, okay, we don't have all the answers for this. Let's bring in people that can help us get to that point. There's no shame in asking for
I
help.
appreciate that. So you're in a structure, there's a rigor and a routine that they're accustomed to. And from my perspective, there's a leadership that lacks a curiosity to create a different pathway of learning and understanding about the business that they're in, because many of them have the resources that they could easily put together a skunk works or a new pop-up or a new activity to learn deeper, faster, whether it's tech, DDC, B2B, whatever the case may be. So I appreciate what you're leaning on. Glenn, you've been inside AG Denim as the interim CEO. You were inside Portage Point. You were with Getzler Henrik, advising distressed retail, among others. Different seats at different tables. What did each one teach you that the other couldn't?
It's another really good question. Well, so I'm going to separate the brand, the retail companies like AG Jeans that you mentioned from the Getzler and Portage Point, which are consulting or advisory firms, because the approach is so very different. I'll attack Getzler and Portage first. Those were opportunities where they needed retail expertise and they didn't necessarily have that bench strength on their teams. I was brought in to supplement. There were projects that we're working on in the consumer retail space. They didn't have the talent in house. So I was brought in to supplement the talent. And that happens from time to time in consulting. I actually think it's best practice. You find somebody that's an expert in their field and you bring them in. So those were those cases. In AG Jeans, it was really interesting because that was a company that was over 20 years old. It's privately held. They manufacture in the United States still. It's a great brand, principally denim for men and women. The owner founder of the company was, a manufacturer at heart. They made jeans for Gap and Abercrombie and a lot of the big denim players back in the day. They had stopped doing third party manufacturing about 10 years ago. And the business was stagnant. And, I give a lot of credit to the ownership. Let's bring in somebody that has some fresh ideas, a new perspective, similar to what you were talking about before, instead of doing things the same old way that we had been doing before. And, I went in there and it sounds really simple, but it's similar to what Bill Clinton said when he was running for president: keep it simple, stupid. The message. And I went in there, it was a denim brand and they had lost their focus. And my focus was keep it simple. It's denim stupid. And really tried to get the teams back into focus on denim. And I think this is a problem that happens a lot of time with consumer products is they see other exciting things happening on the horizon and they want to, jump in, take advantage of that. And they lose sight what their core, advantage of the product was. So that was a really interesting one. That was, retooling everything from marketing to branding to product to have a singular more focus on denim for both men's and women's.
Glenn, I'd like to push on that a little bit further, if I may. Of those experiences, which of those seats showed you the most uncomfortable truth about this industry?
Yeah, I think that's a tougher one. The uncomfortable truth about the industry and through all of my experiences, not just specific to those three, is sort of complacency or status quo. And again, just to reiterate what I said, the pandemic changed everything, particularly for me, on how I looked at the world, how I looked at business, how I looked at customer engagement. So I would say that, what frustrates me often, whether it's in a new engagement that I'm going into in an interim role or whether it's a consulting project that I'm, piggybacking onto, where people aren't curious. I think you used that word before, where the management has failed to, continue to want to learn and educate themselves and their curiosity is gone. Those are things that are hard for me to deal with. And, I'm a doer, I'm a roll up the sleeve type of guy. I like to see things, get done. I'm a big believer in let's get some points on the board. I had a great chairman of the board at one of the businesses that I ran. That was a saying that he used to say to me, you don't have to score the first, play, but let's get some points on the board, move down the field. Those things are hold dear to me. It's, basic blocking and tackling, I think is still incredibly important.
Thank you. Let's talk about blocking and tackling for a moment, if we can, and a great foundational understanding of you and your skill set. So the headline on retail right now is frightening to me, 145% spike in job cuts through 2025, which is continuing now in 2026. Is this a correction? Is it a collapse? Is it a transformation? And does this distinction actually matter to the people inside running the companies?
Yeah. Yes, it has a huge impact on the people inside running the companies. I would say it's a transformation, to be honest with you. All businesses are cyclical and they go through cycles, and retail obviously is not immune to that. I think what you're seeing is a shift in the need for talent in our business, which hasn't happened probably in a couple of decades, and that's the skill sets required to succeed are very different today. I think it's like storytelling and engagement and having integrity, product integrity are more important today than ever before. Consumers are really being a lot more diligent about how they're spending their money. It isn't, price isn't really the only determining factor, though it is an important one. But I think it's trust. I think it's authenticity. I think it's, do they believe in the brand? And I'll use some good examples, and it's disappointing for me to see that, a luxury brand, I'm not going to name the name, but I think everybody will be able to figure it out. But, recently just did, a huge luxury brand, probably one of the biggest and most well known, and certainly from all social media, one of the most followed brands. So carries a lot of weight. And the creative director is also very, very influential across markets, across not just in fashion, in music and entertainment and culture. And they just recently showed, had a big extravagant show, millions of dollars in set and staging and models and the collection. And the accessories were a direct knockoff of a young design studio in England. And there was no credit to the designer or the studio. It was, just a blatant, ripoff or a copy, a knockoff. And we see this from time to time in business. And this is a concern for me because I'm seeing it more and more from luxury players. And there's a right way to do this. We all are influenced by things that we see in the public. I mean, you would not be human if you weren't. But if you're going to take somebody's original idea and you're going to appropriate it as your own without giving credit to credit is due, particularly in this day and age where collaborations and partnerships are so important and so accepted. That to me is where we've gotten lazy, and that's where you lose trust and you lose, the storytelling gets muddled and you're no longer genuine or authentic. And, once that enters into the realm, I think, that's really hard to recover from. So, you know, and like I said, there are ways of doing it properly. And, I'll use a case example, one that was done properly. And it was, several years ago, Gucci was accused of copying a design from Dapper Dan. And Dapper Dan had been a Harlem designer that had taken old Gucci bags and garments and repurposed them with his own original designs, never, always giving credit to Gucci where Gucci was done, but it was sort of like a repurposing of Gucci vintage or Gucci supplies. And when that hit the press and went public, Gucci did the right thing. They partnered with Dapper Dan. They brought him in. They helped finance a studio in Harlem. They helped, they did collaboration and partnership. And so for me, there are right ways of doing things and wrong ways of doing things. And that's something that I would hold particularly luxury brands at a higher level for not being lazy, for being authentic and genuine. That's what consumers expect.
Yes, and that's part of the brand promise and the trust that they
Exactly.
built with heirloom product.
Sure.
Consistently doing
Yeah.
what people expect you to do with excellence is really what establishes the reputation. And for me, it's that old adage of leave it better than you found it. And I get worried when creative directors are ripping others off and not giving credit that they're only caring for today and not taking care of the tomorrow's leaders.
Yeah. Yeah, I would not just luxury that we're seeing that. I think we're seeing that across the board. And that just goes back again to, chasing things just for the sake of trying to get a click or social media, and those are disappointing. I do think that social media has hurt the consumer products category pretty significantly because, everybody and anybody with an opinion can go out there and say anything. And it's, the brands are, have to react and respond. So it's a different ballgame for sure.
Great. So let's sit on this because that takes us directly into the craft and what I'm sensing to be a collapse. And I don't mean to be dramatic
Exactly.
here, but let me run a few stats by you and get your opinion on these. Lululemon, they're down about 46% stock in a single year. Under Armour's minus 32%, if not greater, on the S&P 500 for the same period. And I'm seeing that Nike, Lulu, Under Armour are just three that are struggling, that famously underperform for shareholders in the recent cycles. And Nike notoriously has been down for really 3 consecutive quarters, with the exception of the tariff give back. These are giants. Is the root cause of their decline becoming complacent and a loss of
Yeah.
imagination, creative storytelling?
Yeah. I mean, I think those three, yes. And I
Okay,
think that what happens is these companies get so big that the decision making process gets really mirrored. And so it's almost like they need to create that incubation or that laboratory within that is focused on, research and development and innovation. I mean, all great companies, from way back in time spent a lot of money on research and development and innovation. And I know that when budgets are being cut, those are often the first things to be cut. And that's really unfortunate. So, just to talk about the three that you mentioned, because they're very different cases. I think, Nike, I was really excited when Elliot went back in and he said, everything that we're doing from here on out is going to be focused on the athlete. That's what brought us to the game and that's what we're going to do. And I cheered that. I thought that was authentic, genuine Nike. But then I see things that they've done subsequently. And I know some of these things may have been in work, so they're not under Elliot's, remit. But nonetheless, if I were a CEO and I went into Nike and I came out and said, everything that we're going to do from here on out is going to be putting the athlete first, and then I announced that Nike and Skims is teamed up, that's a head scratcher for me. That has nothing, and it's no disparagement against Kim Kardashian or Skims. I'm a huge fan of the brand. I love it. And I think that there's a place for it. But what does that have to do with Nike? And that to me is just, somebody at Nike thought, well, that will be, that will give us the female audience. That will give us sort of current cachet. What it really signaled to me was the complete opposite, that Nike isn't putting the athlete first, and Nike is chasing these, what I'm going to call, social media clicks or digital moments. So that's concerning for Nike. Nike's bigger issue, I think, is just lack of innovation over time. They've relied on the Jordan franchise for well past its expiration date. Still churns out millions and millions of dollars, but they haven't been able to refill that pipeline. So they're still playing that playbook where there's going to be that one mega athlete that's going to save the day for us. I don't know that we're in that world anymore. I think so. Nike needs to revise their playbook. With Lulu, I think it's just, product is really, really bad product missteps consistently over a period of time. And that's really hard to recover from because once that customer has lost, that faith or that trust in your product, it's really hard to really build back. And Under Armour, I think, should be a Harvard business law, a business case study if it's not already, because that's just been misstep after misstep after misstep, year over year over year. I think that one is probably the most troubling of the three that you mentioned. But, conversely, these three are making mistakes and have made mistakes and admitted them. But the flip side of it is while they were making these mistakes, there were disruptor brands coming up and happy to take market share by doing all the things that you and I have been talking about, building that community, engaging on a genuine, authentic level. Brands like On Running, I mean, that brand didn't exist 10 years ago. Hoka, of course, it has a, big backer, so it's able to do a lot, but Hoka's really, done great. And then brands like Asics and, just traditional, true sport apparel and running shoes that are sticking to what they know are doing really well. So in contrast to Nike, Lulu, and Under Armour, you have a whole host of brands that are just killing it. So it makes it even more obvious what the problems or challenges are at those big brands.
Does this all boil down to distance from the end consumer? Because when we talk about product being stale and not innovative, if you're super close to the consumer, you're getting that feedback
Yeah.
direct
Yeah.
and undeniable.
Well, does it really well as New Balance. I mean, and they have a lot of different collaborations or partnerships with different brands from Miu Miu to Eamon Leandore, and they all look genuine and authentic, and New Balance keeps its part of it. But I think that there's a curiosity in that brand. Their chief marketing officer is a superstar. They have been able to build a business being true to who they are, but also in partnerships and collaborations to extend their reach into new audiences. So, I do think that there's some great examples out there, and they're not all small upstarts. I mean, On's not a small upstart anymore. Hoka's not a small upstart, and New Balance isn't a small upstart.
Well said. And many of these brands were very inspirational at their point in time,
Yeah.
if not aspirational, slightly elusive. And I think that quality has been lost,
Well,
but captured nicely to your point by Hoka and On New Balance as well. Glenn, has there been a fundamental shift in the consumer's mindset away from brand allegiance and toward more toward perhaps item curation?
yeah, that's such a good point. When I back in earlier in my career, I worked for Giorgio Armani, and it was really fascinating to me because Armani designed the collection where the consumer man or woman wore Armani head to toe. And there was a time where consumers did that. You were loyal to a brand, whether it was Armani or Nike, that was the only brand you bought. That started to change. And I would say that it was probably during the pandemic where it really accelerated. And there was a lot of articles where consumers were no longer loyal to brands and they were shopping based on what was available in the market because things were not available or by price because things had gotten so expensive with the supply chain mix up. So yeah, I think you're spot on that. I think there's been a massive shift in the consumer mentality to what they expect from brands, what they're looking in from brands, and their allegiance to brands. It would be rare for you to see somebody dressed head to toe in one brand anymore. The shoes come from one, the shorts another, the top, the headphone. I think the consumer likes to have that option to mix and match. So I think the big shift is the consumer now is in the driver's seat. It used to be brands dictated, this is what you need this season, this is what you need to wear or look like. That's no longer the case.
Okay. Now we're really deep into a shift because we're talking about product innovation and proximity to the end consumer from the manufacturer brand.
Right.
We're talking about the user now curating their own narrative and not being pushed by the brand. Inspired would be a better word.
Right.
Then I land on the actual retail experience. And as you and I spoke previously, there used to be a concept from the merchandiser and from the buyer and the retail shop owner of having a good eye. And that actually
Yeah.
meant a merchant with taste and instinct and the ability to read culture before it announced itself. Glenn, is that a dying art form now? Has it been replaced in its entirety?
It hasn't been replaced in its entirety yet, but there's some great merchants out there running retail right now. I mean, Ronnie, who is running Kith, is just a perfect example. I think the team at Eamon Leandore that I mentioned before is just doing a great job. Buck Mason, so if you're talking about non-athletic, because we've talked a lot about the active space, but I think there are a lot of brands out there. Aritzia is a retailer out of Canada that is just crushing it. So they have a really good pulse on what their end consumer is looking for. Their experience in their stores is just phenomenal. They set up the shop. So when you walk in, there are different concepts depending on what lifestyle, whether it's career or entertainment or travel. So, I'd love to focus, I do talk a lot about where I think there can be room for improvement, but another part of what I do is try to promote and call out these retailers or these brands that I think are doing a really good job. And I think there are a handful of what I'm going to call merchant led that are just crushing it.
Glenn, are they the exception to the rule? And the reason I ask that is I'm thinking about everything from Saks to the new TikTok shops and influencer driven sell through algorithms as discovery and all these other influences that are pushing.
Right. It's um there will always be a need for it. I think what we're seeing, and there's a new buzzword that's happening. We were talking about influencers for the past 10 years, and now they're all being called creators. And there's a lot of talk about this creator economy. So instead of being pushed or inspired by the brand, you're now going to have somebody that you follow, you trust, you like on social media that's going to come into your feed and they're going to introduce you to a new product or a brand that you may not have discovered already. So, and this is really being largely driven by AI technology, where instead of searching online, the consumer will now, be served up, if you will, from AI. Well, you liked this boot from this brand, or you liked this hotel when you went to this city, and they'll start recommending and serving up. So I think that the shift is going to come. There's still going to be those merchants, those creative merchants, because they're the ones that are going to put the ideas out there that the creators then are going to pick up on. And I'll use a good example, Matthew Blazy, who is now the creative director at Chanel. He's only been there for a short period of time. I think he's done 2 runway shows. Already his influence over the creator community is massive. So what you're going to see now is trickle down from his view, his vision, and we're going to see that across all verticals. It's not just going to be in luxury apparel. So I think the creators are going to be what we used to call merchants. It's essentially the same type of thing. It may not necessarily be tethered to the brand. They may be independent of the brand, if that makes sense.
It does. And I appreciate that point of view. The creators economy touches not just those that are making, but those that are shopping for it because they're creating their own ensembles and wardrobes.
So that consumers trust that recommendation from a peer or somebody that they respect or trust more than they would if it was a slick ad produced by the brand.
Well, really well said, which brings up the question about secondhand fashion, because the data that I'm tracking says that searches were up 400% to date. Resale is projected at an $82 billion business by 2026. And I'm wondering, is that the sustainable commercial opportunity? Or is it more of a compliance exercise dressed up as sort of a brand narrative there?
That's such a great question. A year ago, I would have said the latter. It was an exercise to, check off a box. I don't think that's the case anymore. I think we've seen a really significant shift in the I'll call it the secondhand market. I've been a big advocate of this for a long period of time. If you go back to my LinkedIn for years, I equated it to Mercedes-Benz and BMW previously owned, which are hugely successful. The reason that consumers go back to those 2 brands is because they know that the vehicles have been, inspected and repaired or up to speed. So there's a trust level there. It's not a third party, it's the original source. And I've always been surprised why retail brands or consumer brands haven't jumped on this more. And I talked a lot back in the day about the watch business because I thought this in particular, these are high price items that you want to know that you're getting a legitimate quality product and it hasn't been tinkered with or changed. Why wouldn't the Richemont and some of these other watch companies do similar, previously owned, like Mercedes and BMW? And we've seen some of this start to happen already. But with apparel, I think what's happening is this is the younger generation, and a lot of it was driven not by price point, but driven by the fact that they saw all these clothes being produced by mass retailers just ending up in the landfill. And I think that when you talk to sustainability about consumers, I think most consumers would agree, yes, it's a good idea. No, they don't want to pay more for it, but they also are interested in doing their part to try to help the environment and sustainability. And I think this is the easiest first paths in is, we used to call it vintage and there's a lot of history here in, buying secondhand or secondary market product. And it's a cool thing to do. And I think it's just become more in vogue now. People aren't ashamed to admit, oh, I bought this on resale, or this is a vintage piece, or this is a secondhand garment. It's almost bragging rights now. I'm very bullish on it. And I expect to see that we're going to start to see, I would love Ralph Lauren to do, like I called it triple RL just as a joke, buy back a vintage RL and start a new, online thing where you can just go to, triple RL and buy, Ralph has repaired it, he's authenticated it. And, for me, I would rather buy something from 1976 Ralph Lauren than I would from 2026. So, I think it's a big movement, and I think it's going to be driven by the new consumers that are really driving the market. I'm pretty passionate about it.
I would much rather own a triple RL original leather or,
Yeah.
knitted wool sweater that I knew
Yeah,
was
like I would
like
love a vintage
cared for and
500
hand.
Mercedes too, but, so it's
How
I
cool is
think it's
that,
just people coming back and appreciating there was something about this, and there was a miniseries recently, Love Story, that, about John Kennedy and Carolyn Bessette. And I think that, the 90s sort of nostalgia is feeding into this, thrifting or this the secondary market for these, looks. So I think it's something that can be perpetual because it will change as trends change and as consumer interests change and as entertainment puts out new stories. So it's sort of a the secondary market is sort of one that has like an ongoing storytelling capability to me, which is so rich. You're not making something up. It there's roots there.
That's remarkable to me, and I'm amazed that the industry hasn't solved this sooner because, to your point, the shoppers there have a higher lifetime value. There's good money being spent. This is part of the creator's economy, as you pointed out. And so it's of interest to me, and I'm sitting with it for a moment, just trying to understand why it is that they're not leaning into it harder and embracing it, opposed to just treating it as a secondary or a third source, not a primary investment.
I think we're going to start to see that. I think it's just, brands love to make product. They love to make new product. Designers love to design, to produce. So I think that, it's a mind shift, a mindset that has to change at the senior design, the product development, that chief merchant level, to say that we can have, new product can coexist with vintage or retro product. Look at your wardrobe, how you get dressed. I'm wearing a shirt that is relatively new with a pair of jeans that I've probably had for 20 years. That's how we dress. So why wouldn't we shop that way? So I think we're going to get there. I would love to be that person that helped that brand like Ralph Lauren or one of these great legacy brands that has rich history. I would love to be the person to champion that for them.
Glenn, when you land that job, call me. I would love to work with you on that. That would be the most epic
I'm
experience.
Yeah, I'm out there talking to people. I mean, I think this is the next big breakthrough, to be honest with you.
No, I agree with you. Let me pivot for a moment and stay in the conversation of craft and commerce. We talked about proximity to the customer. We talked about the creator's economy and different ways of investing dollars to stay close to what's happening. I'm curious about runway shows. I'm curious about the spectacle, the expense, the seasonal calendar that's driven the commercial rhythm for decades. And I'm wondering if they are still as meaningful a commercial event or merely an elaborately funded vanity project.
Oh my God. That is a hot topic. All right. So I'm going to say some things that are really unpopular. The fashion industry was dictated by the media industry for years. So the fashion product development cycle was designed to support the media long lead print time. So what that means was magazines, it would take 3 to 6 months to print the magazine, get it out to the newsstand. So that meant that they had to have the product, 3 to 6 months prior to that to shoot it, which meant the designers had to have, design it and make it 3 to 6 months before that. So you're talking about 12 to 18 months that a designer is working on a product. It's being shot in a magazine, almost 2 years before it ever hits the selling floor, before the consumer sees it. That was the way things had always been done. With the advent of social media, I mean, I think this is actually one of the benefits of social media. The advent of social media is okay, in 2004, I saw the fashion show. In 2006, the product is hitting the floor. I'm over it already. That's 2 years. What I saw in 2004 that got me excited, I couldn't buy it in 2004. I forgot about it. I moved on. And so there's been a lot of talk in the industry about writing the calendar, the production calendar to do buy now, wear now. Because what's happened is we ship product. If you go into the stores now, it is July. There is fall merchandise on the floors already. There is wool, there is cashmere, there is leather. I'm looking for a bathing suit. I'm looking for a pair of shorts, a t-shirt to wear this weekend. It's really hard to find. And if you can find it, they're marked down and they're limited in size and assortment. So by nature of the production calendar that we were following, the business was self-destructing. We were marking down the goods before you even could need them. So, the margins and the story writes itself. I think everybody knows, the promotional cadence in retail has been probably the single biggest killer of business. So in order to correct that, there was a lot of talk several years ago about buy now, wear now, where a designer would buy the collection, build the collection, and then go to market to sell it. But what happens with that is then the brand is responsible for all that capital because it costs a lot of money to develop it, build the inventory, and then go to market and hope somebody likes what you're. So there really hasn't been a great solution for how to tackle this problem. But going back to your point, are fashion shows irrelevant anymore? I would say that spending millions of dollars, which these brands are doing, for something that might last 3 to 8 minutes on social media is probably not great use of capital. That being said, what I would do is a lot more smaller events, if you will, that I could be feeding out on a more constant and regular basis to engage with my customers instead of 4 times a year. And until we get to that point, I think that these are large spectacles and they're waste of a lot of resources, not only money, but time and effort. And I think what it does is it creates this hype that lasts for a couple minutes and then it's gone away. And we still haven't solved for the problem is all of those bags that I saw from that luxury designer that were copies of the English brand, they're not available for another year. So even though I was crazy about it, I'm not going to be able to buy it for a really long time. So, I think that until we get that cadence corrected, it's still a challenge.
Thank you. I'm thinking about everything from just-in-time inventory to I love your buy now, wear now
Mhm.
conversation. Reminds me of the high-low merchandising strategies that some were using as well to get product into market quicker. The question that's bouncing around in my head, which is maybe a little bit unpopular, was who's the guardian of all of this to be
Mm.
certain that what we're doing is positioning us for success? And my follow-up is asked with deep sincerity, but has the CFDA failed the next generation of fashion talent?
We're going to tackle the first part. Who's responsible? Yeah, I don't think there's one individual responsible. I think this has been a cumulative effect that's happened over decades. I mean, I do think, and each of the different countries, so the CFDA is sort of the Fashion Council for America, and each of the different, there's one in France and one in the UK. So the respective countries, have parties that are supposed to be responsible for helping the consumer products or retail businesses succeed in their sectors. If I had to blame, yeah, I would say that I don't think they've been particularly good stewards about being aware of how the market shifts were, how quickly they were happening, when they were happening, and the remedy for that. And I would say even today, I mean, I think that those bodies are, though well intended, are not serving their constituents well. I mean, that's a criticism,
Yeah,
but
and I asked that. No, thank you. I'm not trying to point the finger, but I'm looking at the institutions that are setting trends, helping guide and develop, having commercial education with deep industry access. And I don't know if they're simply overwhelmed. But these trade associations that could absorb some of these movements and articulate it that broadly to the influential brands to help protect
yeah.
what's coming uh, is one of the things. But I appreciate the perspective. Glenn, as we start to wrap things up a little bit, I'd like to talk just for a moment about AI. I see and hear so much about AI driven trend forecasting and algorithmic buying. this predictive assortment planning that's happening. And I'm curious from your purview, if machines are optimizing the buy and dictating the spend and the markdown cadence, what is the merchant's job now?
That's such, that's really the pivotal question there with AI. I love technology, and I think, my use of AI has been somewhat limited, but I've been impressed with what I've been able to do, accomplish with it. So I think it holds great promise, but it's like any other technology. It's an old adage, garbage in, garbage out. And I think without the right inputs into AI, without the right sort of monitoring it, that it's not going to do what we expect or what the promise of it could be. So I think there always will be that need for that human direction, that human sort of counterpoint, if you will. I don't see that going away at all. And if it does, I think that's a huge disservice. The problem with the predictive analysis can be is it can be rear view mirror mentality, which is something that I talk about a lot, which is it's only telling you what happened in the past. It's not necessarily telling you what's going to happen in the future. So if you're making decisions based on past performance, that may give you some indication of what's going to go forward. But you miss out on something that maybe didn't exist that's new and innovative that the customer didn't have a chance to choose or opt for before. So I think we have to be very careful in assuming that just because AI is predicting that, consumers are all going to want to wear denim shirts next season, I think, you have to go back and you can't just assume that that output is accurate.
Fantastic. I recognize the importance of yesterday to inform today, but a very clear understanding of where you're going to drive the inputs so that, as you say, the outputs are more relevant and positioning for where you want to go.
Well, in
Glenn,
a perfect oh, sorry to interrupt, but just on like during COVID, everybody was rushing to buy sweats and loungewear, because people were working from home and they didn't have to dress up and go out. And if you were, and the predictive models were all saying that that business was going to continue. And the same thing with home furnishings. It took off like a rocket because people were creating their home offices and whatnot during the pandemic. And those businesses crashed down following. But the predictive models all had those as being, sustainable businesses. And one could even argue that the predictive, modeling was that brick and mortar was going to go away and everything was going to be, DTC. So I would just be careful to caution against those massive swings. And there always has to be, it's a little bit of art and a little bit of science.
Glenn, as we come up to the top of the hour now, I'd love to put you in touch with anyone in our audience that would like to collaborate with you, speak to you about consultation, education. How would you like one to go about doing that?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Miles. Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn under Glenn McMahon. It's pretty easy to find. Best way to DM me directly, and open to conversations and certainly opportunities to partner or work together with brands or consumer product companies.
We'll be certain to include that in the show notes and push it through all our social media outlets. Glenn, you've been super gracious with your time. Time is valuable. I appreciate that very much. I'd like to conclude with one final question, if I may.
Sure.
If you were advising a founder right now in fashion, lifestyle, retail, with a genuine creative vision, limited capital that's walking into the market, what's one piece of advice that you would share that they have to hold dear and true every day of operating?
Patience. Be patient. Particularly for somebody that has a really compelling proposition, an idea. The business might be small, but really stick with your gut. Be patient if you really believe in it. If it's solving for a problem that you had, you think that other people have, it's patience. I think that, I talk to a lot of up and coming designers or brands, and the one thing that I see is, everybody wants to be successful. Everybody wants to be a star. Everybody wants to be, well known immediately. It takes time. Be patient.
Sage advice, having a vision, staying to the plan, working the plan, being kind and graceful with the process, not trying to be an overnight success
Yeah.
because there are very few that ever are. Glenn, this has been a remarkable conversation. I'm looking forward to your next LinkedIn post. I read them regularly and then repost them to colleagues and friends, both in and outside of the industry. You offer a perspective that many don't with your work as a product obsessed merchant that's also sat in the boardroom and advised investors. I appreciate the perspective that you bring. It's financially savvy. It brings operational rigor and a level of creativity that is super sharp. So thank you. Thank you
Well,
for what
thank
you're
you,
doing. Keep
Mal.
doing it.
Well,
And
thank you.